Hey everyone, today we are honored to welcome Noelle Mering, author of Awake Not Woke, a Christian response to the cult of progressive ideology. Noelle is a cultural commentator, fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and co-director of the Theology of Home project. In this episode, we unpack the origins of wokeism and its foundations in conflict theory, explore the profound significance of gender difference, and rediscover the true meaning of Christian identity amidst the chaos of contemporary ideologies. If you like this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this episode with anybody hungry for deeper conversation. How do you define it? What somebody who's like, we hear the word. Where did the word come from? What are the different philosophic strands that have gone into sort of the key tenets of wokeism?
Yeah, how to define it is definitely a hot topic and a hot question. Oftentimes people say it's undefinable, or that it's just a pejorative, and people who are sort of taking a stand against it can't actually define it. And I think part of the reason why that is easily an easy accusation is because it's complicated, and it's there's a lot of different ways you can get at it. I think it is fundamentally similar to having a raised consciousness. So, for example, a Marxist would say that part of the evangelical mission of the Marxist is to evangelize people into having a correct consciousness. So they begin to see the world not through the lens of sort of assuming that the structures of society are benevolent and good and helpful, but rather to start seeing them all as a means towards keeping oppression established and normative. And so that to have a right consciousness is to really sort of see through that, to see that oppression surrounds us everywhere we look, that everything is a sign and shadow of evil, of repression and evil in the core of society, and that it has to be fundamentally dismantled. So I think it's to start seeing things structurally in society, also to start seeing people as collectivized, as avatars for politicized identity, and to start seeing our freedom as being our ability to exercise our will in a way that is particularly transgressive. So to become woke is to start to understand that we are oppressed not only from identity groups around us, but also from the moral law. And that part of our liberation is defying the moral law, because the moral law is simply a social construct. And so that means becoming transgressive. Acts of transgression are, a flag planted for our liberty. I think that those two sort of awarenesses of what oppression is, politicized, collectivized groups, and moral normativity. And once we start to see those as avenues of oppression, then we can start to revolutionize them, help others to see through them. And eventually, obviously the target of all of this is God himself, who is the author of the moral law. And also the author of the human person and human nature. So it really is revolutionary. One author in Canada defines it as the sacralizing of historically marginalized identities. But I think that's a good definition too. Tidier than what I just said to you. But in other words, taking certain politicized, marginalized identities and making them unassailable. They cannot be criticized, and a different moral equation applies to them than will apply to other people. Because, there's not a moral principle at stake.
Right. It's really interesting about the focus on victimhood. And I've heard some say that you can think of wokeism as a kind of Christian heresy, in that a heresy takes some truth, focuses on it to the distortion of all the other truths, but there's a kernel of something that it's latching onto, but it doesn't have the full array of other truths to kind of balance it out. And it seems like wokeism, the way you talk about oppression, it's really zeroing in on this sense that, well, oppression is bad, helping victims is good, but it does so through simply the lens of power dynamics. But But if you were asked to just do a total steelman argument for wokeism, if you were to say, is there any strand of goodness or truth in it that because there's a lot of people, especially young people, get passionate about some of these issues. What is it that they're seeing that we can kind of retrieve before we go into the criticism of it?
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job of indicating what the most compelling part about it is that, it is always taking a partial truth. And so particularly when that partial truth is personal narratives of people who have suffered legitimately, it's true that, there is a positionality there, where I don't completely know what it feels like to have walked in their shoes. No one can really know. And so insofar as, we think about personal stories of victimhood, it becomes really difficult to not sort of excuse maybe an excess of rhetoric surrounding it. So, for example, when the Me Too movement was happening, and there was a slogan that women would say, and it was "Believe all women."
Yeah.
And on the face of it, that simply doesn't really make sense. I mean, women, there's nothing about womanhood that makes us immune to lying or to having the full reality of the truth at our fingertips and only being able to speak it. But, it's easy to say, well, we can sort of overlook sort of that excess of rhetoric in the face of people who have suffered so much, that women, that there are truly, women's stories that were publicized at that time that were, horrifying and abusive and truly had been victimized. And so, and similarly, I think the phrase Black Lives Matter, I can completely understand how, in the face of thinking of stories of racial injustice, that the reclamation of the truth that their lives matter and are significant and are important is very compelling, And so I 100% understand why people get pulled into all this. And, part of it is also because it's an appeal to compassion. So I think that ideologies coerce people on 3 different levels, and usually starts with compassion, moves from compassion to fear and then to force. But the most effective way, I think, is through compassion. That's the way you catch most people. And it's also the most compelling of the 3. People can sort of see through an appeal to fear and see through force. Then it becomes very obvious that you're being manipulated. But if it's at the level of compassion, it's very compelling because people's stories of suffering are really compelling. But B, because we are, really living in a society where many people still have religious affiliation, often usually Christian, and if they don't, there's still the vestiges in their, genealogy oftentimes or their communities of a Christian ethos, and compassion's at the very heart of that. And so, if someone's saying that there is polarization where this is the side of compassion and this is the side of hate, it's hard to say, well, I'm going to take a step and be on the side that everyone's telling me is the side of hate. And so most people, I find, will just kind of default to the side of compassion. And even if that means even if there's sort of a coercion in it that, in order to, your compassion has to be applied in this particular way. And oftentimes what I'll hear is that people say, I didn't feel like there was something off about it, but I went along with it, because I didn't know how to articulate what was wrong.
And it seems like, it's like taking an impulse, a Christian impulse, but without the reality of love, which alone can kind of break through just the power of politics. And I wonder, I think in the book, I think it's really important. You go back to looking at the philosophic roots of this in Hegel and in Marx. Could you talk a little bit just about like the dialectic, the move from Hegel's dialectic to Marx, and then how that gets then adapted from just a purely economic analysis to cultural analysis, and then the merging of Freud with some of the folks from the Frankfurt School. Just some of the history that you share in that book is tremendous. If you could just kind of a survey of that would be really, I think, helpful.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, understandably, people, I think, oftentimes don't see it because, well, for one thing, Hegel's really hard to understand. He writes in a sort of an impenetrable way. But so the simplest way that I think I can reference this in modern society is when people say you want to be on the right side of history. That's a very Hegelian statement. So the idea is that society, like an organism, is self-developing towards an ultimate end, the end of history, when there will be an absolute sort of a great mind that will be harmonize all the contradictions out of it. And the way we get to that end of history is through what Hegel called the dialectic, which is sort of the engine of progress in society. And it is simply the reality that, at any point in time, there are contradictions within a society. There is, sort of a status quo, which you call the thesis, and then there's a conflict or pushback against that. That's the antithesis. And then through sort of the synthesizing of those two, often through, the death of, some synthesis that caused sort of a sort of death and then a sort of new growth, you reach the next stage. And then that will bring its own polarizations and own conflicts up to the fore. And they keep kind of in this sort of spiral of battling it out until you've harmonized all contradictions out of the society. And Marx was a materialist, and so he glommed onto this sort of engine structure of the dialectic, but applied it to economic division. And so, this is where you see, even in your earlier reference, when you said there's so many, this is sort of a Christian heresy. It really is. And, so many heresies are taking two things that should be held in harmony and making them opposed to one another so that one eventually triumphs over the other. And this is what Marxism and the dialectic do by nature, is highlighting division until it is eradicated through the triumph of one over the other. And so Marx, primarily was applying this to sort of a class division, the ruling class and the working class. But he already had the seeds of, he was an atheist. He believed, he and Engels wrote about how women are kind of the proletariat and their husband is sort of their ruling class. So he had all sorts of seeds of, cultural antagonism already implicit in his writings, or explicit. And so the next phase is that after his death, he had left a lineage of acolytes and who were disappointed that the revolution had not come to be. He had said that it was inevitable. And they formed a social research institute in Frankfurt, Germany, that matriculated into the United States in around 1935. And they were very influenced not only by Marx, but also by Freud. And so they brought this kind of convergence of conflict theory along with sort of the sexual, overwhelming definition of a human person that Freud instituted, and then studied how can we hasten this revolution? Because if we want to get to the next stage of progress, we have to keep revolutionizing society. And they, alongside with the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, understood that you have to not just fight revolution on the level of class warfare, but also in the culture and through the institutions. And so the Frankfurt School figures famously understood that, we need to, particularly Herbert Marcuse, we need to look for other fault lines within society and then stoke them. And so an obvious one was racial tension. Yeah. Another one was, the increasingly radicalized feminist movement. Also people who are sort of more bohemian they were naturally kind of allies with something that wanted to question and revolt against traditional social mores. So they really agitated all of those fault lines until they started to explode quite violently, for a point in the 60s. And then at that point, the culture really kind of sort of roused up against it and realized, they were too exposed as being too radical. It was too much, too fast. And so what they did is they pivoted more deeply into the institutions. So a lot of, you see several figures from like the Weather Underground, Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, moving into things like influential chairs in teachers' colleges, where they understood, if we can really seed revolutionary ideology into superintendents and into teachers, then they go back to their school districts and they seed it further
Yeah.
there on the molecular level, and then it gets turned into, the classroom, and then into the mind of the child, and then really from the child back to the parents. So the the ideology was seeded really through not only institutions, but through the classroom, through the child, then from the child back to the parents, and then now it's sort of just kind of everywhere through our
Yeah.
media. It's all over the place.
And so basically the move from a traditional Marxist analysis of culture, namely that our identities in a way are conditioned by our economic class, this gets shifted over to group identities like gender, like men and women, and therefore the family seems to be a big problem, a kind of a structure that just inculcates this patriarchy. And I'm wondering, you talk in the book, but also in a recent article, just about conflict theory and how that plays into gender dynamics and the family as in a way enemy number one, because it becomes the sort of focal point of where oppression happens.
Yeah, no, the family, I think, is, what most immediately and also first in the order of time, and maybe most powerfully communicates the identity of the human person. That we are made to be familial. That I am a daughter, or I am a son, or I am a husband, a brother, a wife, a mother. These are very foundational ways that human beings have always, communicated who they are and understood themselves. And that is a window into understanding that we're invited to a divine family too, and divine filiation as sons and daughters of a good and loving Father. And I think that, once that gets distorted, it becomes not only difficult to understand who we are, it becomes difficult to understand who God is. And so the family is, such a target because the family is so powerful and such a remedy for all this ideology. But yeah, what's particularly fascinating to me that I've been speaking and writing about more lately is just the idea of conflict theory, how we see this playing out, the dialectic. And I think this is so important to understand in order to sort of not fall into certain traps that I think the dialectic sort of points us to or invites us into. So one way I think to understand it is it's like if you can imagine a pendulum swing or like a pirate ship roller coaster ride at an amusement park that just goes back, oscillates back and forth. That really imitates the dialectic. That the dialectic wants us to always be reacting from one extreme to the other extreme. And it gets back to that heresy thing, right? That two things that we have to go back and forth between two extremes rather than seeing two things not as polarized, but as an invitation to be harmonized. So man and woman is a perfect example of this. That, we will, so for example, we might say at one point in time in the not too distant past that the family is destructive for women, that it's a patriarchal institution. And so women should flee the home. This is one of the things that 60s feminists were big on saying. Betty Friedan, Carrie always brings up this quote. Betty Friedan would say the home is a comfortable concentration camp. What a description. And Simone de Beauvoir had some really choice words for the repetitive, boring drudgery that almost to the death of housewifery. So you see them, so then the solution is for women to flee the family. And similarly in the church, I think, for a while the church is sort of, you can't help but see it as kind of having a patriarchal element. I mean, all the Pope is a man, the priests are men, the cardinal, and seen under the lens of not fatherhood, but of oppression, that looks really distasteful to the person who has absorbed the dialectic in their imagination. And so I think one of the ways the church has responded to that problem of keeping women in the church has been in a really superficial way. And that's part of the dialectic itself, is to keep things on the surface. And so, so that I think, oftentimes the human element of the church might say, well, maybe the solution is, we have more feminized music. We have more women participating in the liturgy. Maybe all these were well intentioned, but then you wind up with, all these songs are like, Jesus is my boyfriend. And, there's not really a place for men anymore. And I think that's been a model of parish life for quite a while, is that, there's a priest figurehead, but it's a very feminized space. And so, for a while, men were leaving the church in spades. And now we're seeing this interesting dynamic where there's all these articles being written about how men are returning to Christian faith, both Protestant and Catholic. Women are the ones who are leaving more often. But then there's this other disturbing dynamic of men are sort of rejecting fatherhood.
Yeah.
And I think,
Yeah.
even that is a symptom of the dialectic, that once we successfully communicate this, again, dialectical, polarized message to men that they are either buffoons or they are bullies, which we've been
Right.
telling men for a long time through shows and movies, well, then they no longer really see a purpose or a mission for themselves in family life. And so,
Yeah.
it makes sense that they would kind of walk away from that too then. And so, so my concern these days is that it seems like people are, insofar as they're sick of kind of all of these ideologized messages that have kind of birthed out of, radical feminism. Now there's a swing to, well, men just need to go weightlifting, and women wear really traditional dresses, and
Right.
there's of course the trad wife movement. And I don't have any problem with the trad wife, Instagram. I think I don't know it very deeply, but it seems to me to be
Sure.
beautiful and inspirational. And if that's inspiring people to live a beautiful life, then I'm all for it. My only concern is that on both ends, for both men and women, there has to be real depth there, and that
Right.
if we say masculinity is, I'm the head of the household and I don't have the virtue to back that up, that's
Yeah.
going to be a problem,
Well, and it seems performative, whether it's the trad, the trad guy with the three-piece suit and the pipe and all that. Nothing wrong with pipe. Well, pipe's great and three-piece suits are great. But when it
Yeah.
becomes a kind of costume almost, or it's almost like you start identifying yourself as against these other groups you're still kind of playing the same game almost, or you're still playing an identity game as opposed to, I don't know what you say from the depth. What is masculinity from its metaphysical depths? What does that actually mean, as opposed to a performance? And and the other performances are the Homer Simpson buffoon or the toxic masculine predator. But they all seem like kind of like masks or costumes. And what's been lost is is masculinity and femininity part of this structure of being itself? Does it reveal something about reality itself? And what does that mean when you live that from the depths rather than just a kind of costume level? That's my concern about overly because reactionary towards, like, let's just do exactly what they did in the 50s. Well, that can't exactly be. I mean, not to criticize any of it. I mean, I'm just trying to understand it. But it's part of it. If that's as deep as it goes, you're still kind of playing the same game in a way.
I think that's exactly right. And there's so much to that because, for one thing, I think if it's reactionary in a way that it is, like you say, sort of a costume without sort of the depth of complexity and richness that, true manliness implies, then it's not going to be compelling. And so what you're going to do is you're going to kind of turn away a whole host of people because it's sort of transparently, I think, performative. And so in some ways, it doesn't matter which side the pendulum is swinging on. If it's, as long as it's kept in the realm of the superficial, it's a win for for dialectical materialism.
Yes.
And you can see this actually in a deeper way. I just prepared this for a conference a couple months ago, but I hadn't really seen it before. But with the evolution of gender theory, I think really exposes this. So Simone de Beauvoir talked about, you're not born a woman, you become a woman, because womanhood is, gender is a social construct that is imposed on us externally. And then by the time you see gender theory in the hands of Judith Butler, decades later, gender has become so internalized that it is more real to us than our very body. It becomes like our soul. And so to the point where our body has to be manipulated in order to conform to what gender is. So it goes from an external construct imposed upon us to the deepest part of who we are. And I think what is lost in all that is actual depth, which is human nature. And so it also maps onto, a Marxist saying, which was society makes the man, but then man makes society, meaning all of these sort of impositions are creating the passive man who doesn't realize have the correct consciousness. He's being influenced without even realizing it. But then eventually,
Yeah.
once he has the right consciousness, then he can now transform reality. And so you see, gender theory maps that same Marxist construct. But I think in
Yeah.
even a more superficial way, that what we're talking about with men and women and all of these like pendulum swings and reactions is doing the
Yeah.
same thing, that it's keeping everything on the superficial. And so there's good and bad news. The bad news is it's not an obvious formula, what we tell men, what they need to do. Wear this, do that, and then get this, these muscles, and then you're manly. It's actually something that is less tangible, but far richer. And so I think
Yeah.
what the answer is good, virtuous men, and mentorship, embodying it, living it out confidently and openly in the world so that it can be communicated through their very being. And it's, less easy to see, but it's far more compelling and far more powerful when it's sort of lived on that deep soul level. That is the call of holiness and manliness and virtue that makes a real man a masculine man.
I think that's so important, and also the sort of the complementarity between masculinity and femininity. You wrote. I just was going to read this because I thought it was excellent. You write in, I can't remember whether it was one of the recent articles that you published, but decades of ideology have disposed society to interpret the meaning of the differences between man and women through a lens of conflict. Differences between groups, whether between men and women or other categories, aren't viewed as opportunities to cultivate harmony or unity, collaboration or cooperation, according to conflict theory. Instead, differences are only oppositional and imply dynamics of power and oppression that must be exposed, reversed, and diminished on repeat until they are eliminated.
What I was writing there about, I was trying to draw a contrast between conflict theory and paradox, which I think is helpful for me and hopefully for other people too. But the idea that two things, rather than seeing man and woman as in opposition and therefore having to define them utterly independently. I mean, this is that in and of itself belies the nature of the human person, right? The fact that we can define a man independent of women, and we can define a woman independent of man. But rather than doing that, which is what conflict theory invites us to do, paradox, and I talked about Chesterton in that particular piece that invites us to see two things that are different, and that difference does not invite us to feel threatened, but rather invites us to feel mystery and reverence, because it points to the fact that the other is truly other, and it's not if that otherness does not threaten me, well then that invites me into sort of an exciting adventure, and it says something about the nature of reality itself, which is partially veiled, that this world is not the only world that we know and can see and can believe in, but that there is a hidden world that is maybe less tangible but far more real. And so that induces in us reverence. And so, the lens of paradox, I think, really is the ultimate antidote, in a way, to conflict theory. And that's what we see really with Christ on the cross. The cross is the perfect example of conflict in, even the vertical and horizontal beams. And that's the intersection which Christ hangs, inviting us not to see conflict there, but to see the greatest love imaginable in a suffering God. And a suffering God is not something that conflict theory can even fathom, right? The materialist conflict theory sees like, well, if you have all the power, you just choose not to suffer. Power and domination go hand in hand. Power and suffering do not. Submission does not. But if and so his, the crucifix really is the ultimate defeat, not paradox, but even the crucifix, pointing us to the understanding that there's another measure entirely that conflict theory cannot access. And that measure is far more mysterious and exciting. But we see that in a microcosmic way in the relationship between man and woman in marriage. And so it seems like that's why, the family, and another reason why the family, marriage in particular, is such a threat, because it really is a powerful entryway into this whole other world of mystery and meaning that it defies all of the materialism of conflict theory.
Right, and there's something in the family where it works against this idea of, I mean, in conflict theory, it seems to presuppose that we're all in competition with each other. And so the way we talk about men and women and how they're doing in society, it's always in terms of how are they doing in competition with each other, in terms of all sorts of, a whole host of issues. It's just, it seems to want to eliminate difference at all costs. But difference seems to be the presupposition for love, because when you are encountering the other, even the Trinity is an example. There has to be otherness for there to be love. Otherwise, if everything is the same, there's no difference, and everybody's exactly like me, you're left with a sort of very bland world, certainly not a very mysterious world or interesting world. And it seems like that the family is the very place for, sort of the battleground for, in a way, reality itself. The more you look at it, and even my own life too, just growing into being, got my kids are small now, 3 and 9 months, and you just learn so much in the family dynamic about what is life all about.
The place where our will butts up against someone else's will.
Yeah, that's for sure.
A lot more, in a lot more obvious ways, and everyday ways when you're in the intimacy of family life.
So true. Yeah.
And so what are you going to do with that? But when your will butts up against someone else's will, if you have a lens of competition and conflict, well, that's going to go poorly. If you have a lens of love and service, then that's going to be maybe hard, but that, struggle is eventually going to soften out all of these parts of yourself that ought to be softened, in a way that makes real love really possible. And so that's the irony in a way, is that love, everything that's traditional, these marriage and, invitations to the religious life, that men are supposed to be fathers and women are supposed to be mothers, spiritually or biologically. This is really the heart of love, and the way that the word love has been co-opted to say the exact opposite is really a manipulation.
Well, even love is an interesting slogan, because it doesn't define. It says, what is that? I don't know what that means exactly. Love is love, but it's kind of a tautology. I mean, so what? Well, in the tradition, there's been a lot of work that's been done to try to define what love is, because to simply say love is love, I don't know what to do with that exactly.
It tells you nothing.
Presupposes that we know what it means. Yeah. So
right. I think, and that's a slogan. Slogans are the death of thought, right? They're what they would say, thought terminating cliches, that they give you a peg to sort of hang an idea on, but you don't go deeper. They're meant to stop you from thinking more deeply. And that's part of their success. If you just chant that enough and repeat it enough, then people will just be like, oh, that's where love is. That's what the sign of love is. So, I'm not going to be judgmental, or I'm not going to have any sort of definition. I think it's effective in the way that all sort of slogans can be effective.
Totally. One of the things I wanted you touched on a little bit, but I thought was really interesting, was the move of, so you traced a little bit of the history of this Marx's, economic critique, the failures of that really to materialize, aside from kind of the Bolshevik Revolution, which it'd be hard to say that was pure Marxism. I mean, Leninism was really its own thing. But the real failure of Marx prophecies to come through led to this move towards a critique of culture, a kind of pushback that took place perhaps after the sexual revolution of the 60s. Then, in your analysis, led to a kind of embedding of this stuff in the academy. Could you say a little bit more about that? This whole conception of education not as like inculcating a young person into a tradition or into a society, a kind of formation. It became much more about waking people up to where oppression is, waking people up to various binds that are preventing them from the full flourishing of their freedoms.
Well, I think that maybe the most common thread is that it seems like it is shifted from being an invitation to the freedom to true freedom, right? The liberal education is meant for the free man. And we can really grapple with ideas, but also bring us to a point of wonder and reverence, because beauty and transcendence are part of it, into sort of a really flat world of utility. And so one particular point where I think there was a shift, there's probably a lot of them, but I remember the shift to even Common Core in public schools, that there was a real lessening and devaluing of literature and
Yeah.
poetry. And you can see that at different points. The understanding of the schools as having an important part of it, as grade school level having an important emphasis on memorization of poetry. That really went by the wayside. But literature, and then the types of books is another sort of shift, and I think we've seen that really become a flashpoint over the last few years, in particular. That I think public schools have really been exposed as having just really sort of activist sort of books. And it mimics, I think, Hollywood, right? That, movies at some point were about telling true, really human stories. And then eventually just sort of devolved into what oppression narrative are we going to fit into this formula? And then, drive home this perception that oppression narratives sort of surround us. Then the Frankfurt School guys, some of the figures went to Hollywood to really put their imprint into movie making there too, the culture there. And they would even say openly, you want to exaggerate the problem. You want to make things seem even worse than they are, because that's how you communicate.
Did you mention It's a Wonderful Life as one that would be particularly problematic from their mind?
Yeah, and even just the fact that he comes, towards the end to really love and appreciate his family, that in and of itself, that you don't want to awaken someone to the happiness on offer in the simple, what they would say bourgeois life. You want to awaken them to the misery of that life. You don't want small town fatherhood to seem beautiful. You want it to seem restrictive and maybe menacing.
Yeah. Right. And so then that same thing was happening in schools, to sort of, you don't want to give kids some idea of this oppressive structure that they could enter into. You're trying to poke holes in that so that then they can, I suppose, in their language, exercise more freedom and agency. But the result, I just saw a recent article you wrote about how was a study in Finland, just about how unhappy this is causing people, or the misery that this is actually resulting in, of people who really just imbibe this stuff to the dredge. It's just like the sense of this is not leading people into happiness. Yeah,
that's right. I've talked to so many people at different schools, and also, therapy is another big one. Abigail Schreier wrote that good book, Bad Therapy, about this, but that, oppression narratives are seated not just in our education system, but also in crisis institutions that are supposed to be there for, to really address the health of the child. So I think that article you mentioned, I had a young man who was suicidal, and he was getting put in outpatient care. And it's a very woke environment. The stickers, the banners, gender ideology was surrounding him. He had to do exercises on exploring his identity. And then he had to do a privilege walk, where he had to, come to grips with the fact that he was a white male. And, you would think that the grown-ups in the room, taking a 14-year-old boy who was maybe, at this lowest point you can imagine, wouldn't be trying to impugn him with, collectivized Marxist guilt at this point, but would rather be trying to help him to, flourish. But this is just, it underscores how totally pervasive ideology is, that you can't even really see the obvious need of the good of the child in front of you. In fact, the child is reduced in some ways to just sort of a conveyor belt of activism, regardless of whether or not this is actually for his good. And I think the public schools have certainly, and this is a broad statement, there are definitely fantastic teachers in the public schools individually, but as a whole, they've really adopted a lot of this. Pedagogies of the Oppressed is a book that is, read widely amongst public school administrators and superintendents, and it's full of very Marxist ideas, and then certainly in higher levels of institution. I think there's a reason why we're seeing so many protests and really disrespect towards authority figures in higher education. I mean, it's really it almost doesn't make sense now unless your child is really grounded and ready to be a leader and has the courage and the conviction to kind of withstand a lot of ideology. It's really hard to see how that money is worth it at this point. You know, you send them, I see so many people sending like an 18-year-old, and then they come back and they say, well, guess what? I can't stand everything you raised me to believe. And I almost can't stand you. You know, I mean, this is what they tend to churn out now. So, you know, the good thing is I think people are seeing through it a lot more than they have before. And, you know, hopefully there's going to be a large correction coming. And I think we have a huge opportunity also to really evangelize in this moment when people are sort of questioning all of these narratives, seeing their folly and looking for another way.
Do you feel like, I mean, it seems like there has been a bit of a sea change from where things were, even maybe COVID was at the height of it? Or do you sense that there's been a bit of okay, there's enough. This has just gotten too silly.
Yes.
Across the culture. I feel this that way to me.
I think there's been a major shift. I think there's a ton of different signs of it, but one of them being that I think a lot of people who are not religious at all are starting to seek out the faith or faith at all. There was a comment, Naomi Wolf, who was a very progressive feminist, who made that really maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago, that really struck me. That she said she's become convinced that there's such a thing as evil, and that has led her to start wondering if there's such a thing as good and such a thing as God.
Wow! And
I've heard that repeated from various figures who were either atheists or agnostics, or just would have said they had very little interest in anything Christian prior. So there's something happening. Holy Spirit is certainly at work. And I think people are praying, more ardently. I mean, this is anecdotal, but I find that people are turning to prayer with more ardor than maybe they had before. And, the interesting thing, too, is that I think oftentimes it can be far easier for them to have some sort of encounter with our Lord than we might think, even through, or just encounter with love. That there might be a lot of anger sort of on the surface, but a lot of times, oftentimes it's just stemming from masking sort of just deep desire to feel a true identity, to feel loved, to feel like you belong, to feel like you're protected. All these things that that are familial, but with, families having oftentimes so many wounds and ruptures, there's a lot of people who are raised just without all of those very foundational things. And so, and so insofar as that can be communicated to them, and this is why it's so important for us not to become, you talk about the dialectic, the mirror image of, angry, political, hyper-politicized people, because then we lose the whole point of what we're doing, and so, insofar as we can really give our attention, our care, our interest, I think those things go a long way to someone who doesn't feel that their personhood is dignified by anyone in their life. So, I think hospitality, friendship, openness to other people, all of these things they're always important, but they become almost, the stakes have become almost so incredibly important that it's negligent to not be, really thinking about how we can be better at those things and make more of a priority of them.
I love that. I think that's so true in that, the power of that dialectic. There's something that is unmistakably true in that as a dynamic, but I don't think it's almost like the Simone Weil's book Gravity and Grace, and there's a way in which without grace, without love, you kind of do fall into that back and forth. This triangular relationship, me versus you. There's some kind of reconciliation. But to step out of that whole game, and as Christians and as Catholics, to not do that, don't go there, because you're grounded in something deeper than just that. That I think is more important than ever, because there can be a false sense of almost excitement where, we're getting another convert over here, or that we're going to be just waving the flag. It's got to be coming from real sanctity and depth and being tethered to reality, rather than we're just another group among other groups playing a group game. Are we doing this because this is for Christ, or are we doing this because it's our group that we named after Christ. There's a danger there. I've noted myself, especially as a younger man, I was, very happy to wave the flag, and then you look back and you're like, some of that was good, but some of that was really playing into an us versus them game. So,
Oh yeah. Same. I've seen that, and we oftentimes learn these things from falling prey to them. And there's so many landmines that the devil lays, for us to, even if we can get beyond the kind of the tribalism, then there's also the, feeling like we're winning one for even just spiritually. I got that person
Right.
to, come to whatever,
I know.
making it about ourselves. We're so
Right.
soaked in ourselves, but so yeah, that's why it really it can't be performative in any way. It has to really be from a wellspring of our, prayer life that is, and our silence and our rootedness in Him, so that we can get ourselves out of the way and actually show who He is.
Totally. Yeah. I guess before we conclude, is there, just curious in terms of your own, where your current interests are, or things you're working on now, or where is this, because you've gone very deep into this over the last couple of years. Do you have a sense of where this particular line of inquiry is leading you, or what particular topics are really front of mind right now for you?
Yeah, I'm working on a new book, but it's just really in the inchoate stage. It is sort of an outgrowth of all the ideology and family stuff. So hopefully I'll be able to talk about that more publicly soon.
Cool.
But also it's really reconvicted me in the importance of the Theology of Home project. I think that because it is there's so many pitfalls to kind of sorting through what is man, what is woman. It really can't be, this issue really can't be ultimately put on sure footing through merely policy wins, or through like the avatars and the pendulum and the reactionary movements.
Yeah.
It really has to be through embodiment. And, the whole point of Theology of Home really is kind of showing this is what, ordered family life looks like. This is what, it means, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be truly masculine, motherhood, fatherhood. And here are the common threads, whether you're a woman who is, never married, whether you're religious nun, whether you're an infertile mother, or a mother of 10 children, or someone who's lost a child, or a professional architect, woman working in the world, that there's still this thread throughout all of these different lives that is really quite beautiful, but it has to be communicated in sort of a deep and rich way. And I think that Catholics, having that presence in mediated spaces like you're doing, and like so many talented people are doing, that's really kind of a core component of Theology of Homes, that so much of the culture has been taken by ideology, not because people were reading Hegel or Marx, but because they were watching movies and television shows. And so it's good for us to have a space there. And Theology of Home really has remained, I think, at the core of my work.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really important work that you're doing, and I'm grateful to, the time and dedication that you've taken to help, so many of us understand this better. And just, it's been great to be able to spend some time with you talking at length, and hope to do it again soon.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much for not only inviting me to this, but also to those awesome, fantastic projects that you've been at the helm of. So I've been real honored to be part of it.
Absolutely. Well, we'll talk soon. Thanks so much.